your background, Ojibwe, First Nations community here in the Smithers area. How does that work? How do you balance that? Because there was a number of questions that came up about First Nations hunting and what the enforcement looked like, and that's such a complex question because there's so many different bands throughout British Columbia that, but they all get that blanket First Nations label put on them.
Yeah, and again, I'm a unique. There's a couple First Nations COs in our outfit. And at times I think I get ridden a little harder by the First Nations because I'm First Nations and in an enforcement role. And sometimes they look at me as a traitor, hurting my own people. And on the other side, they're really happy and proud to see me in the job I am as First Nations. And so I get a bit of both. But I also can relate to a lot of the encounters we have with First Nations. And because I've been there, I get it. I grew up in that environment. I understand and I know, and I'm well versed in what the title rights are and traditional territories and how the enforcement rolls out and how that works. And when I'm trying to explain that to some of the First Nations, they buy into it a little bit more because I'm First Nations and they can see it from my end. So I'm able to step with one foot on either end of the fence in that world. And you know how we have a little in BC, we have a little different enforcement way of doing business compared to say Alberta or Saskatchewan, and we're very much First Nations can harvest in their traditional territory, and kind of if you are a status from say Saskatoon or something, and you're here out of season and you just shoot a moose. And you still have a status card, well, we treat you no different than anybody else shooting a moose out of season. You have to be from that First Nation in that traditional territory. So that there's a little difference there with BC. We don't have all the big treaties like the prairies do. We have a small part of Treaty 8 in the north. But other than that, we don't in the rest of the province. Uniquely, we do have memorandums of understanding with some of the bands. So Niska or Gitnyao have implemented with cooperation from us, and we've drafted an enforceable memorandum of for instance, you can't shoot a cow moose. And they'll have a draw for bull moose on their band in their traditional territory, and they'll share the list with us of who in their band is allowed to harvest a bull moose within these dates. Anybody outside of that, we're free to prosecute just like anybody else.
Holy crow. And this is something they voluntarily came up with?
In conjunction with us, yeah. And there's also in Williams Lake area and a few other places around the province, we have a memorandum, like Williams Lake Band, you can't shoot a cow moose out of season. Or, nice. And so depending on the band, it depends on a little what sort of restrictions they want to place. But we have a First Nations cell in our agency, and they sort of spearhead that effort. We do guardian training to help some of the local First Nations help with being our eyes and ears, and maybe if they're first on scene collecting, preserving the scene, or maybe asking some of the questions that we need to be asked. So we have I think we're not there yet, but we still need to develop that relationship, and it's getting better. It's certainly better than when I joined, and it can only get better.